Hi, everybody. It's Public Relations Week in Media and Society. So crack open a frosty cold Eagle Claw hard seltzer and let's learn a little bit about this weird industry of public relations. First, let me move the presentation over here. Let's click that button. There we go. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about PR. Now, most people have a pretty good idea of what PR means at the very surface level. My goal here is that a combination of this video and the chapter this week will give you a better indication about what professionally public relations is actually responsible for. Starting things off, I like to steal definitions from Wikipedia. Wikipedia defines public relations as the practice of managing the spread of information between an individual or an organization, such as a business, government agency, or nonprofit organization, and the public. Simple enough. But what does that actually mean? Important questions to answer here. Like, where does all of this start? Where do you even get PR as an industry? Where do you get public relations as a thing? It turns out that the need to carefully control and craft messaging around your idea or a thing that you manufacture has kind of been around for a really long time. And we can actually track back really old examples comparatively of things that if we had a word for it, we probably would have called public relations back in the day. Like the American Revolution, right? So pamphlets like Common Sense that were printed as justifications why it was okay for the United States to be in rebellion against the United Kingdom, against Britain. The publication of propaganda materials like the Join or Die flag, which shows a snake chopped up into little bits with labeling on it that shows that those are the different colonies and that they either have to all band together or all die separately. We didn't have a word or a phrase called public relations back then, but this was very much intended to get people on the side of the anti-British during the Revolutionary War. Also, so much of the early abolitionist movement, we can see some of the underpinnings of public relations in that as well. The goal of not just trying to end slavery, but recognizing that the goal, or recognizing that the path there has got to be to convince people that slavery is wrong. If you can convince people that it's wrong, then you can get people to push the government into getting rid of it. But the Industrial Revolution, which is a turn of the century, the 1800s into the 1900s, that's when we really get what we would call professionalized PR. It's when you start to see the idea of public relations become its own industry and become its own thing that people can specialize in. It can specialize in and be hired by other companies that will then use your proficiency in that skill set. So the Industrial Revolution was a massive time of change in the United States. It was when a lot of people were moving from rural areas into cities to work in factories because the jobs paid a lot better and they were considered a lot more upward mobile, although that didn't always pan out. It was also when you saw a massive uptick in immigration into the United States. You started to seeing more innovations in consumer goods on the shelves that people could buy. Society was changing very, very rapidly at this point. And one of the things, one of the outcomes of this industrial revolution is that you start seeing the growth of very large companies, companies like Standard Oil or Carnegie Steel, where they would own everything in the process. Standard Oil, for example, would own the oil fields and the pumps that took the oil out of the ground and the refineries that converted the crude oil into usable petroleum, and then the distribution, the rail lines that would take the oil and petroleum products to factories, the factories that would then process them into very early plastic products or fuel. They owned all of it. They owned the whole thing. So companies like this grew massive and they had tons of money. And along with having lots of money came kind of a negative approach, or a sort of a negative viewpoint from society. They were seen, the people who ran and owned these very large companies, sometimes they were called trusts, were not seen as the best people. They were sort of seen as robber barons was one of the terms that would get used a lot. They were seen as kings and emperors of their own making. They secretly were the ones who controlled the government because they had all the money and could influence Congress. A lot of these accusations were not wrong, to be clear, but increasingly it became important for these large super mega companies that had all of this money and influence and power to try to have a positive public message or positive public image. They didn't want people to see their companies as being these robber barons. They wanted to be seen as a positive influence in society. And so you start seeing the growth of PR come out of that era. Now think about another reason, other than just sort of not wanting people to hate you. Think about some other reasons you might want to have good public relations in this time period. One reason is because it really lines up well with stuff we've talked about previously in this semester, which is the battle for New York City between Hearst and Pulitzer. Their two newspapers were duking it out. And as a part of that, in order to try to have a leg up on the competitive newspaper, the other newspaper in town, these newspapers hired reporters who can do investigative journalism. They were big into muckraking. They were big into investigating companies that were, manufacturing bad medicine or were covering up the truth of certain deaths would be a thing that would matter a lot here. And so because you've got this small army of reporters constantly hounding you, trying to find something you've done wrong in order to be able to sell more copies of their newspaper compared to the other guy, you want to be able to control that. You want to be able to put your best foot forward when you're dealing with these reporters. Another thing that is coming about in this era is the progressive political movement. So this era becomes known as the progressive era. We start to see the growth of progressive politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, who would go on to be a one-term president, almost became the first third-party president in the United States history, but didn't quite get enough votes. But Teddy Roosevelt campaigned on busting up the trusts, of taking these large monopoly companies like Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel and busting them up and forcing them to be busted up into smaller companies. And so the idea of, oh gosh, these popular politicians are campaigning against us, is what these companies thought. We need to make sure that maybe we're not hated as much as we are right at the moment. We need to make sure that we put a positive face on our company. And so this era of industrialization and these companies sort of developing these needs for the first time of making sure that they're liked brings about two fathers of what we would call modern public relations. Two folks whose impact we can still see. For those of you who are public relations majors, these are two folks you're going to study as you move on in your PR classes, and whose impact you're still going to see as you produce public relations materials, as you develop campaigns, that kind of thing. Let's look at the first of the two, and that is a guy named Ivy Lee. Ivy Lee was born in Georgia and went to Emory, so we get to claim him in this state, which is pretty fun. Ivy Lee represented a lot of railroad companies. He was originally a newspaper reporter, and then left newspaper reporting to go work in public relations, or work in media relations, is sort of one of the best ways of putting it. So he was one of the first of many, many, many people in history that worked in PR but got their start in journalism. It's a thing that's still happening today. Reporters who will work for a while in news and then go work in public relations. He represented a lot of railroad companies. Their railroad companies were sort of like airlines are now. They are massive companies. Think about how often you hear in the news nowadays about airline companies needing to be bailed out because of low traffic, because of the coronavirus. It was seen back then as just as big of a deal. Railroad companies carried your cargo, they carried people across the country. They were the connection point from city to city. Railroads were very important. But railroads also had a lot of accidents. They would, promise that's not coronavirus, I promise that's just allergies. So the airline, or the railroads rather, all right, better now. Had a lot of derailments, and derailments had a habit of killing people. Now, before Ivy Lee came along, the railroad company's standard practice, if a train derailed and people died, was just to try to cover it up. If newspaper reporters asked them about a derailment, let's say outside of Pittsburgh, they would just lie and say it never happened. If they would go and try to pay off the family members of the victims to not talk about it, offer them large sums of money. They would lie in towns and cities and say that like this wasn't our fault, or this wasn't actually our train, it was actually another company's train. So lying was sort of what they did. That was how they handled it, was to try to cover it up. But it never worked for them. And it really took Ivy Lee to come along and point out that like, hey, you know, this whole lying about the accidents thing, yeah, it's weird how that never seems to help, right? Like that only seems to make stuff worse. So he took a reverse angle. Instead of lying about it, when the press starts to cover up an accident, let's just accept responsibility and help the press. Let's take the reporters to the crash site. Let's point out what went wrong with this train or with the rails it was riding on that would have caused the derailment. Let's just be honest with the press. And being open and honest with the newspaper reporters made the railroads and made the railroad companies look trustworthy. It made them look like they cared. It made them look like, hey, yeah, we're willing to own responsibility for this, and we're going to make improvements moving forward to make sure that this doesn't happen again. It turned out trying to cover it up would just keep the press hounding at them. As soon as a newspaper reporter got a sense that a company was lying, they would just press and press and press and press. By being open with them, and talking to the reporter and saying, yes, this happened, here's how many people died, here's what we think went wrong, and here's how we're going to investigate it, it made sure that all the reporters who were asking questions about it got the single, concise, correct answer. And so Ivy Lee sort of builds a golden rule of public relations, which is this quote, which if you are a PR student, you will see many, many times over your education, which is, tell the truth, because sooner or later the public will find out anyway. And if the public doesn't like what you're doing, change your policies and bring them in line with what people want. So it's sort of a two-point quote, but it's very important. First part is, hey, don't lie because it doesn't do any good. Lying is just going to make the problem worse in the long run, so why do it? And the second one is, hey, if people are mad at you for doing something, instead of lying to them about the fact that you're doing, and instead of trying to say, no, we're not actually doing that, change your policies to meet public demand. And by doing that, you're going to make yourself look like you care about the public and that you're listening to the public, both of which would be very important roles for public relations moving forward. Now, the other fellow, other than Ivy Lee, is Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays got the bright idea of taking the findings of a rapidly growing academic field at the time and shape that into the art of controlling public image in a company. And the growing academic field that at the time was sort of new, but now feels very old, is psychology. And fun fact, I believe Edward Bernays was actually Sigmund Freud's nephew. So that could be how he even heard about psychology in the first place. And Bernays has the bright idea that public relations is an engineering problem, that it's an equation that we can feed things into, and if we can figure out what the best result will be. This isn't some sort of mystery. We can study people. We can study how humans react to things, how they react to messaging, how they react to certain slogans, how they react to certain actions that we perform. Bernays believed that public consent, also known as people being okay with something and not being angry about it, was something that could be engineered. He actually wrote a book called The Engineering of Consent, which was all about ideas on how to make people start liking you better if you were a company, and is still something that we think about and teach in public relations. There's this quote that we can sort of pull from him. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, aka how people think, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it, aka how can we make people like us without outright asking, please like us, or sort of forcing people into it. Now, what he did with this knowledge was sometimes good and sometimes bad. It did work, but how he applied it is a little sketchy at times. Like, remember the United Fruit Company? We had talked about them when we were talking about the radio and about monopolization in media in general. They were the company that would go on to be called Chiquita Banana, and they were notorious for overthrowing Southern and Central American governments and massacring anybody who got in their way. They were very, very bad people. And so he worked for them for a little bit. And one of his goals in working for them was to make people pay attention to the good side of uh, the idea of overthrowing governments and killing people. And the way that he tried to do that was by saying, well, by overthrowing these governments in South America and Central America, what we've done is prevent them from becoming a communist government. And we don't like communism, they're bad. So we've actually just helped, we've made the world a better place. Which is, you know, kind of justifying genocide in a lot of ways of a lot of people in South and Central America. So applying your PR skills to that, maybe not a great look. He also was one of the first people to come up with the idea of advertising cigarettes specifically to women. He was very famous for a PR campaign that was called the Torches of Freedom, which was this marketing / PR campaign where he would push advertisers, or he would to message in certain ways, and he would put out these press releases about how these tobacco companies were liberating women, or had recognized the liberation of women in society. And he would run public press releases that sort of looked like this, that would say, "Women are free and ancient prejudice has been removed." And the goal of this was to try to sell more cigarettes, but by doing it, it was saying like, hey, women are free to smoke too. Which again, in retrospect, because of cancer rates and all that, was not a great look, but it was an application of some of the stuff he was developing. And there is kind of an inherent irony in public relations that is kind of reflective of the two things I just talked about, right? Using PR to cover up massacres of people, and to use public relations to sell more products that kill people to vulnerable populations, is that public relations as an industry does not have terribly good public relations, which again is one of those top ironies, right? So how many times have you heard somebody say, if a company does something good, they'll say, oh, yeah, but they're just doing it for the public relations. They're just doing it for good PR. They don't actually care. They don't actually mean that, right? So the phrase just doing it for the PR has become a slang term for like unearnestness. Like, yeah, they don't actually care. Public relations specialists are often called flacks by journalists and other people. It's kind of a derogatory term for people who work in public relations. The messages that they put out into the world is called spin. So when PR gets involved, you'll hear people say, yeah, well, they're just spinning it in that way. They're just spinning it this way so that you'll feel good about it. Part of it is a problem of visibility. People don't really see public relations and the good it can do when it is working correctly. When it's working correctly, you never see it. You only really visibly see public relations when something terrible has happened, and the Gulf water horizon explodes and dumps oil into the Gulf of Mexico for months. You see more public relations from BP, and suddenly then the idea of public relations is like, oh yeah, but they're just trying to spin things in favor of BP. We rarely ever think about PR if everything is going well. This is going to be a point I'm really going to push forward in the next video, is that there are ways in which PR operates day to day that we will never see, but once we know about it, we can recognize it. And it's one of those things that I think if PR wanted better PR for the PR industry, I promise that will make sense, they really should embrace letting people know more about what it is they actually do. And as far as what they do day to day, well, we will talk about that more on the next video. So with that, I will see you all next time.